another episode of Equity Mates on AusBiz. My name is Bryce, and as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy, Ren. How are you going?
I'm very good, Bryce. Great to be back for the second of our four-part long-form interview with Julia Weng.
Yep.
Great episode yesterday. If people missed it, they can catch up on demand. But today we're talking all things ESG.
Super important topic in the Equity Mates community, and one that Julia is particularly passionate about. So let's welcome back Julia Weng from Paradise Investment Management. Julia, welcome.
Thanks for having me back.
So yesterday we talked about the broad landscape and your investment process, and now we want to spend this episode unpacking your views on ESG, how you incorporate it into your investment process. But before we start, how do you broadly define ESG or sustainability?
Yeah, it's a great question because it means different things to different people. But a quote I like is from 1987, and it's by UN Commission, and it says that a sustainable company is where current earnings don't borrow from future earnings. And so, that really strikes a chord because it means that whatever the company is doing today, it shouldn't be at the expense of future growth in revenue or profitability. And so that extends the time horizon for how we are assessing investment decisions. So, in this lens, sustainability is absolutely a business strategic priority, and how we're thinking about it, it's mostly either a opportunity or a risk, and that's a direct impact on our investment decision. And so, for example, a company that's polluting the environment um, these days are punished through a high carbon tax. That's not great for your costs. It can be punished through loss of customers who go to a competitor with better credentials or traceability of where raw materials come from. It could also have limited access to natural resources. So, for example, if you're just logging endlessly, lumber prices will eventually go up, and that catches up with you. And things like modern slavery. Again, if you're not sustainably sourcing your cotton, for instance, that cost will whatever you're sourcing today is unsustainable, and so the cost will rise and has a detrimental impact on margins. Um, and similarly through governance, for a board that's not having all the right governance in places or things in place, or appropriate remuneration incentives that look a little bit further than the next 6 to 12 months. Again, you're going to have turnover of management, and that's a red flag that in our investment process. So hopefully that shows how ESG have a direct impact on our investment process.
I love that framework that you introduced, borrowing from future earnings. That's not one I've heard before, but I think it captures it quite nicely. So I guess that's conceptually what we're talking about here, sustainability, ESG. When I guess the rubber hits the road and you're analyzing a company and you're talking to management and you're looking through their financials and talking to suppliers and customers, how are you actually, I guess, testing a company for sustainability concerns or ESG credentials? And maybe if you have a particular example that you've looked at recently that could help illustrate how you actually do it in practice.
Yeah, sure. Look, ESG, there's a lot of growing data and transparency. And so, we use a lot of different data providers, and that's something that's, still a journey for us. But, we use Bloomberg, MISCI, Sustainalytics data, for instance, and, that equips us with data to engage conversations with. So, for example, your scope one, scope two emissions, gender diversity, whether you have net zero targets, your safety metrics. So that gives us data from which we have conversations. But I think the bulk of that framework or research is through engagement, and I think that's what separates active management also from passive. I mean, active management is funds management is probably, is where you can engage with the company and the board on these really important conversations. And often, ESG um, often comes out through things like regulatory risk. So, for example, if you're endlessly polluting, there will be a regulatory catch up through carrot and stick. So, for example, you're seeing more and more examples of government, providing funding for renewables, for recycling, at the same time, applying carbon tax, and that as a sort of a punishment to change more quickly. And when we think about how we factor that into our valuation, it's a very direct flow through. So, for example, let's use packaging, plastic packaging. I mean, everyone just goes, "Oh my God, like let's get away from plastic." But I guess we take also a very holistic view of sustainability. So whilst we might want to all get rid of all plastic in the world, plastic does help to minimize food waste and reduces reliance on landfills. It's something that we take into account. So, for example, when we look at a company like Amcor, which is a leader in plastic packaging, there's two parts to it. There's risk opportunity. If it's able to come up with, very recyclable materials, uses recycled, plastic or try to lightweight plastic, then that can potentially generate revenue at a higher margin when it's a different point of differentiation versus competitors. On the other hand, recycling plastics at 8%, which is very low compared to things like paper and can. So if you to the extent that your customers like Nestle are trying to move away from plastic, that has a detrimental impact on your revenue. So there is so it can come through revenue or cost or even cost of capital, as we're seeing with a lot of the oil and gas names in the market. And to look at some other good examples, I think ESG is often talked about as a risk, but we are seeing more and more examples where ESG is an opportunity. So Bingo, for example, is a stock that we invested in. It's a leading recycler of building demolition waste, and it was a leader in the industry. Um, Material space. I mean, we talk, EVs and the battery materials. I mean, what's probably little known is everyone goes, let's try to minimize carbon. While that's a absolute goal that we should be aiming for, materials is actually a key part of decarbonization. So carbon is, I guess, not the only measure of sustainability. When we look at property, again, a lot of property companies are trying to minimize fossil fuel generated electricity, and that's actually affecting, tenant preferences. So what's also really interesting is when you think about what are the leaders in ESG, again, it really depends. It's not just the lowest carbon companies. And I think that's a really interesting sort of myth floating around that I hear a lot about. Circling, like tech companies are great ESG companies. I mean, that's true, but also it's true by virtue that they are software companies. So by virtue of what they do, they are low carbon. Um, but I would also suggest that, 40% of carbon emission comes from sort of hard to abate sectors like steel and cement, airlines. And these are pivotal to our economy. So I would, suggest that the leaders of ESG, you need to look at it in the context of what industry they're in. So, if you can reduce steel emissions, I mean, steel accounts for 8% of global emissions. If you can come up with technology to reduce the carbon in that's going to be more of a game changer than another tech company. So yeah, it's a really fascinating space.
No doubt, it's very fascinating. You're very passionate about it. You mentioned there a myth around people calling tech companies sustainable. Are there any sort of key myths that you think a lot of the market has wrong about investing sustainably, or when people come to either screen companies? Yeah, what other myths are there around sustainability?
Yeah, another one that comes to mind is the role of divestments. When you trying to reduce carbon content across a portfolio, you are literally doing that. You're trying to reduce it. You're trying to decarbonize your portfolio, but you're not necessarily decarbonizing the world. So, if a company tries to dispose, high carbon parts of the business in traditional hydrocarbons, you know, it could be going to an unlisted player who might be accelerating investments into that space or provide less transparency and data about it as opposed to a listed player subject to higher regulatory and investor need for information. So that needs to be considered. So I guess what I'm saying is divestment is not always the best way to address. And for us, engagement and constant conversations with the board and management about strategies and are they investing enough, reinvesting enough back in to work out decarbonizing technologies, work with your customers on a global scale. I mean that potentially has a more pivotal and beneficial outcome rather than divestment. So yeah, I guess that, yeah, the key themes are one, low carbon content needs to be considered in context of what industry it is. Two, the role of divestment, and also what is renewable investing. It's not all about solar farms and wind farms. I mean, wind farms globally, your returns are about WACC plus 100 basis points. So that's not an attractive investment outcome for us. So back to our fiduciary duties as fund managers. We're there to generate investment returns. So hot theme or a trendy theme doesn't necessarily make a great investment. And sometimes you need to look a bit closer at what makes money.
Julia, one of your areas of expertise is in financials, and financials is always a really interesting part of the market for me when I think about ESG, because the money that they're investing or that they're allocating can have such outsized effects in terms of getting renewable projects or fossil fuel projects off the ground. How do you think about looking at a financial company and looking at, I guess, the scope one, like what the company itself does, but then broadening it out and looking at where they're investing or what projects they're funding, and how does that sort of factor into your, I guess, investment considerations?
Yeah, great question. I think banks assess a whole lot of industries. Their core engine of the economy, and so we try to understand, I guess, exposure that they have to some of the industries, whether in sunset industries, which may not be around for a long time, and so the or default grows over time. It may not be apparent today, but could be in 10 years time, and you know it can accelerate as well. So if you're a part of a syndicate um, that's lending to a thermal coal industry a company, and if some of the lenders start to pull out, you're left with bulk of the debt, and it's a very difficult decision then to go, do I support that or do I not? So it really depends. And same time, there's a lot of newer areas of business that they can grow into, like renewables, hydrogen. And so to the extent that they're looking out for opportunity to lend into these type of markets, and green bonds are extremely popular. So yeah, I think it forms part and parcel of a bank's risk assessment framework in terms of ESG, and it flows onto your insurance companies as well. At the end of the day, the purpose of an insurance company is to assess risk. And so to the extent they take into account climate change, physical location, and what the risk of flooding, the risk of fire, into how they select properties to insure, that will have stronger and stronger risk and profit and loss outcomes. But as we mentioned, Macquarie is a great example of a financial that's positively leveraged to sustainability. and it's a thought leader, and employs scientific, environmental scientists, people who work, in that industry, not just finance people. And there's a long tail of opportunities in that space, and clearly there's a lot of demand from infrastructure clients going to that.
Now, Julie, almost out of time, but I just want to close out with a quick question. If there are retail investors out there like Bryce and myself that are interested in incorporating ESG concerns into our investing decisions, do you have any advice on things that we can do, in our day-to-day investing lives?
Um, um, to read broadly. There's so many conversations about this, but it's good to sort of dig, look under the hood a little bit and work out what is popular, what is a myth, and what's going to generate you money. So end of the day, it comes to investing. It comes to investing, and so understand the economics of it before you invest.
Nice, Julia. Well, we have run out of time, unfortunately, as Ren said, but we are very much looking forward to having you back on tomorrow for Watchlist Wednesday. ESG, super important topic, not only amongst the Equity Mates community, but now obviously more broadly as well. And any sort of insight we can get from experts like yourself always helps on the investing journey. So thank you for today, and we're very much looking forward to rejoining you tomorrow.
Thanks very much.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. We will be getting Julia back for 3 stocks on her watch list tomorrow for Watchlist Wednesday. So stick around and we'll see you tomorrow.